Women and children first. It's the catch cry of disaster. It has been for centuries. In times of peril at sea, it was societies vulnerable that had to be protected and whisked away to safety. But in 1898, the world was shocked when an ocean liner sank and women were literally beaten back away from the boats. The stories that ran in newspapers horrified the public, and they still do. A star transatlantic ocean liner, a jewel in the French merchant fleet's crown, had sunk after a collision, but the human tragedy that played out had seen crew members attacking passengers for space in the lifeboats. It would change maritime law forever and have important consequences for disasters in the near future. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and this is the horrifying story of the final voyage of the SS La Bourgogne. The year is 1886. The Belle Epoque is at its zenith, dazzling the streets of Paris. With the end of the Franco-Prussian War, the country embraced arts, culture and commerce. The elegant forms of Art Nouveau could be seen in the city's advertisements and architecture, while the fever of the poster craze, a fishermanie, transformed the streets into galleries of colour and light. The nightlife in Paris was especially thrilling. Cabaret performances were held in the clubs, glittering temples like the acclaimed Moulin Rouge, where dancers kicked away doing the scandalous can-can. A newly prosperous middle class indulged in all the hedonistic pleasures that were once exclusively reserved for the elite. Under the patronage of the French Ministry of Post and Telegraphs, the renowned company Générale Transatlantique, French Line, France's premier transatlantic shipping company, commissioned a new class of 4 ocean liners for its Le Havre to New York route. This was the vital passage for mail and migration that linked the Old World, Europe, with the New. Each of the 4 CGT vessels was christened after a province of France: La Champagne, La Bretagne, La Gascogne, and La Bourgogne. La Bourgogne was built by Société Nouvelle des Forges et Chantiers de la Méditerranée at La Seine-sur-Mer in the south of France over 2 years. In late 1885, she was launched and completed the very next May, costing something like over 7 million francs, which was a fortune at the time. As an embodiment of prestigious French engineering and Belle Epoque luxury, La Bourgogne's launch was a milestone. This was France at her glorious best, competing directly with Britain, Germany and Italy for dominance of the North Atlantic. All the usual fanfare took place, with officials, dignitaries and her proud owners in attendance to witness their creations sent sliding into the sea with the crash of a champagne bottle on her bow plates. La Bourgogne was a fine-looking ship, measuring roughly 150 metres, nearly 500 feet long, and tipping 7,400 gross registered tons. She embodied the very best of France's 19th century maritime engineering capability. Her original machinery had consisted of a pair of 3-cylinder compound steam engines driving a single screw propeller, which gave her a top speed of about 17.5 knots. She was no slouch, and she had specifically been designed to put pressure on Britain's Etruria and Umbria and their speedy transatlantic runs. Presiding over her modern silhouette were a pair of tall funnels that marked her out as a cutting-edge steamship. But vessels of that era hadn't really fully ditched the sails that sprouted from their masts in their entirety. To squeeze a couple of extra knots out of her speed, La Bourgogne was rigged for sail on 4 metal masts which could be hoisted up and lowered thanks to steam winches. Her composite steel and iron hull could accommodate more than 1,200 passengers, with 225 in first, 72 in second, and up to 900 in basic accommodations in third class. In keeping with the Belle Epoque craze, La Bourgogne's public rooms included a selection of impressive first-class lounges and saloons, lit from above during the day by skylight domes, and at night, the entire ship could be lit throughout with more than 600 electric bulbs. From the outset, La Bourgogne was not only a glamour queen, but a speed demon. On her maiden voyage, in the summer of 1886, under French Line's popular fleet commodore, Captain Franjoy, La Bourgogne reached New York Harbor just over 7 days after she left Le Havre, averaging a daily run of 350 nautical miles. Her achievement received huge media coverage and celebration. Clearly, French Line and their 4 Greyhounds were stiff competition to Britain's Cunard and White Star lines. In her early service, La Bourgogne welcomed plenty of distinguished passengers like St. Francis Xavier Cabrini, America's first saint and the missionary sisters of the Sacred Heart, who established charitable missions and hospitals throughout the US. In late 1889, the ship transported a French cultural treasure to New York, Jean-François Millet's painting The Angelus, which was said to be the most expensive work of its time when it was sold at auction. After La Bourgogne delivered the painting to the American Art Association in New York, The Angelus was bought by the prominent French collector Alfred Chauchat within 1 year, and it was later consigned to the Louvre Museum in 1909. Today it actually still exists, and it resides in the Musée d'Orsay collection. With her impressive speeds, ornate saloons, and modern amenities, La Bourgogne and her sisters soon became the premier Oceanliner choice for transatlantic travel for both middle and elite class passengers. But she was doomed not to be a happy ship, and her career was riddled with drama and near misses with tragedy. She'd been designed with safety in mind. A double bottom protected her from below, while her hull had been split into watertight compartments by 11 bulkheads inside, and these safety features would soon be tested. In early 1890, La Bourgogne collided with a British cargo steamship. Both vessels were soon quickly repaired, but it certainly wasn't the last collision that La Bourgogne would experience. 6 years later, off Le Havre, La Bourgogne hit the Tigre, a French steamer, in heavy fog. Again, it was only a light collision, but 3 weeks later, it happened again. At the mercy of dense New York fog, the liner was threading her way into the harbour within the Narrows, a half-mile off the Hamilton shore, when she struck an anchored British steamer. The collision opened up the smaller British ship's hull, and she sank quickly. But fortunately, all of her crew were rescued, leaving only her masts and the tops of her funnel lamely protruding from above the water like some kind of sea castle. La Bourgogne herself sustained a 4.6 metre, 15-foot gash to her starboard bow above the waterline. It was pretty serious. US legal proceedings, including at the district court, examined the events from both perspectives of the ships involved, and the collision report found that fog was no less dense for either ship, and La Bourgogne was maintaining between 2 and 4 knots, which was the acceptable speed. The owner of the British ship, the Atlas Line, was looking for compensation. They filed a $400,000 lawsuit against French Line, but by August, the Maritime Court of Cherbourg in France exonerated the skipper of La Bourgogne, Captain de l'Oncle, ruling the collision as a peril of the sea. This was a pattern that would soon continue. In July 1886, La Bourgogne rescued the crew of a German sailing ship that had sprung a leak. It was a heroic act sandwiched between bumbling collisions and tragedy. But by the late 1890s, the ship was starting to show its age a little. The elements had taken their toll on her, so French Line decided it was time to rebuild their prized vessel. Renovations carried out across a year through 1897, when La Bourgogne underwent a sweeping refit in a French shipyard, transforming both her machinery and her layout. Her aging compound engines were ripped out and replaced with modern quadruple expansion ones, giving her renewed power and a greater speed of 18 knots. Up on deck, La Bourgogne's profile was simplified, with her 4 masts reduced to just 2, as at last wind power was dropped in favour of full steam propulsion. Below deck, her refurbishments were even more telling of the signs of the times. As North America enticed immigrants with the promise of the American dream, La Bourgogne's third-class capacity was dramatically expanded to accommodate up to 1,500 steerage passengers. By the end of her refit, the old liner was reborn. Nobody knew it yet, though. She didn't have very long left to live. On a cool summer's morning, July 2nd, 1898, La Bourgogne was pulled away from the French Line pier at New York with some 725 passengers on board and just over 220 crew for a crossing that was supposed to be like any other. The tricolour snapped proudly in the wind as she eased away from her moorings, and her engines thumped into life to push her across the Atlantic to Le Havre once more. On the bridge wing stood Captain Louis de l'Oncle, the skipper who distinguished himself in danger once when one of La Bourgogne's sister ships had burst into flames. Among the passengers were some rather affluent Parisians who had splurged on lavish items during their trip to New York. Others represented a more diverse professional background. The Turkish professional wrestler and recent American heavyweight champion Yusuf Ismail, known as the Terrible Turk, as well as the American painter D. Scott Evans and his 3 daughters. Also among the passengers was the French impressionist painter and clarinetist Léon Porteau and his wife, and the American sculptor and instructor Emil H. Wirtz. In steerage was a mixed group, including 75 Assyrians and 13 Armenians, many carrying whatever savings they'd managed to accrue in the US to give to family members back home, somewhere between $100 or $200 each, which could really go a long way. The first 2 days of the journey were, by all accounts, benign. The 83 first-class passengers settled into the refined rhythm of pampered life in the salons and lounges where formal dinners were multi-course and accompanied with a staggering array of French wines and spirits, while evening cocktails were enjoyed taking in the sprawling crystalline waters that stretched endlessly beyond the rails. Below decks, the experience was, of course, more modest. The 123 second-class passengers and 297 third were mostly European immigrants whose dwellings were functional, but crowded. No matter though, those on board, returning to their families, were just relieved they were so close to home. Following the usual North Atlantic route, La Bourgogne headed northeast after she'd cleared New York, tracing what mariners called the Great Circle route, the shortest possible path that skirted the southern edge of the Grand Banks. Favoured for its efficiency, the Great Circle route shaved valuable time off the crossing, but it also carried ships into colder, fog-laden waters, where warm currents like the Gulf Stream converged with the cold breath of the Labrador Current. 2 days into the voyage, on July 4th, La Bourgogne was 60 miles off Sable Island, Nova Scotia, in waters where thick fog threaded across the water like smoke. Just before 5 a.m, the fog swelled to the thickness of cream. Visibility collapsed into a few uncertain meters, which would force most ships to slow their speed through the heavy damp and continuously sound their foghorns. Captain de l'Oncle kept La Bourgogne up to 15 knots. The ocean was dark and hauntingly quiet as fog swallowed up the sound of the outside world. A wall of mist enveloped the French liner in quiet solitude, but she was certainly not alone. Nearby, the British four-masted barque Cromartyshire edged through the fog at a steady 5 knots. The 1,462-ton cargo ship had slipped her moorings at Dunkirk with a cargo of coal bound for Philadelphia. From her forecastle, the seaman on lookout eyed the prowling fog banks with the chief officer, while on Cromartyshire's poop deck, Captain Oscar Henderson, his wife and his third officer, listened and sounded the foghorn every minute, a hollow moan that was instantly swallowed up by the roiling fog. Unable to hear the blare of the nearby ship, Captain Louis de l'Oncle did not slow his own. La Bourgogne's engines thrummed as her hull knifed its way through the waters as normal. But soon, somewhere within that suffocating white, Captain de l'Oncle could just pick out the low mechanical rumble of a foghorn bleating a worried cry. He replied with his own ship's whistle. Some of the passengers on La Bourgogne stirred from the volley of sound and drifted out onto the promenade deck to lean against the railings, straining their necks to glean the silhouette of an oncoming ship. But nothing materialised. For a disquieting moment, the foghorns fell silent. Only the sound of the cold Atlantic waters slapping against the hull and the rumble of the engines could be picked out. Then, without warning, everything changed. Cromartyshire lunged through a curtain of fog. La Bourgogne tore through her bows and ripped away the sailing ship's fore topmast and the main gallant and all the yards attached to them. They came crashing down with their blocks onto the deck like a violent hail of timber and iron. It was over in seconds. La Bourgogne steamed off into the fog at speed as the crew of Cromartyshire were left behind, enveloped once again in silence, with the ship at danger of sinking in just minutes. They immediately sprang into work once they got over their shock and began shoring their vessel up. Aboard La Bourgogne, though, passengers and crew apparently hardly noticed it. For all the speed and violence of the impact, the actual shock of it had been slight. Many berthed towards the stern simply slept through it, but those at the bow couldn't have ignored the tidal wave of water that roared into their cabins and rose to their chests in seconds. As it came, La Bourgogne's carefully balanced trim was thrown out of whack, and the decks of the ship began almost immediately to lift and tip sideways over to starboard. The iron knife edge of Cromartyshire's bow had punctured through the vessel's hull and opened a spread of watertight compartments up to the ocean. A barrage of seawater began to flood La Bourgogne's hull with enormous force. Passengers and crew berthed down below urgently began clambering through the ship's corridors, fighting each other to reach the upper deck, but many were caught out, unable to find a way up in time as water began to rise up over their heads. On the bridge, Captain de l'Oncle immediately ordered his officers to swing out the ship's 12 boats and a small selection of rafts while he and his men could figure out if the vessel could live. Sailors sprang into action, scattering to their stations as the ship continued to list over at a treacherously steep angle, water roaring in all the time below and cutting off escape routes in the labyrinthine interior. De l'Oncle shouted to his officers from the bridge to ascertain the extent of the damage, but their responses were drowned out by the venting steam and the calls of anxious passengers who uneasily gathered and bumped into one another on the boat deck. Soon, open conflict would break out that would see them fighting for a spot in the few lifeboats. Captain de l'Oncle had a plan. He knew that Sable Island couldn't have been far away. He rang down for full steam. If he could run his wounded ship onward, she could beach and be stopped from sinking. 8 awful minutes passed as La Bourgogne settled awkwardly onto her side. Then, 4th Engineer Les burst onto the bridge, breathless. His report was damning. The stokers had watched wide-eyed as water surged into the boiler rooms, and running the pumps was hopeless. The men evacuated as the water put the ship's furnaces out. Then the chief engineer had blasted his whistle in warning as it began to pour into the engine room. The watertight doors had been shut, but clearly the hull was opened around the doors too because it seemed to have no effect. The stokers and the engineers rushed to save themselves, but even then the speed of the flooding was terrifying. Maybe as many as 15 of them were caught out by it and drowned where they'd just been working. The engine room was abandoned. Without steam, she couldn't hope to race for Sable Island. Captain de l'Oncle clenched his jaw and he knew in an instant of quick calculation that his ship was doomed. Officers and other crew members shouted orders in French and English for passengers to remain calm, but their voices were lost to the ruckus as boat chains were smashed off, the covers ripped open and the davits hauled out. Lifeboats swung waywardly, whacking the sides of the ship with a sickening thud. The boats began to slowly fill, but it was anything but orderly. One boat with 40 women refused to be released from its davits. Some crew furiously cut the rope falls, but then the ship careened like an angry bull and the boat broke loose, launching all the women into the water 3 stories below. From Cromartyshire, Captain Henderson watched red sparks blaze as La Bourgogne's crew fired off rockets that burst and arced through the pallid morning light. Mournful whistle blasts carried across the water, insistent but oddly pitched as the ship's steam died, a clear cry for help and a portent of desperation. But Captain Henderson didn't yet know if his own ship was lost or not. From his vantage point, the damage looked severe. The whole section of Cromartyshire's bow was torn away and his men were still checking below to see if the flooding was hopeless and they needed to abandon ship. He had his own wife and children to worry about. For the time being, Henderson and his men were utterly preoccupied. But just across the foggy water, hundreds were fighting for survival, and many of them were losing the fight. Aboard La Bourgogne, 29-year-old Swede Fred Niffler was travelling with 14 of his friends and countrymen for a visit back home. He had woken early like he always did at 5 a.m. and went for his morning stroll, only to be taken aback by the sight of splinters and shattered iron spread across the deck. An officer told him that all was well, but as the liner began to list and passengers appeared on deck in their life jackets, he suspected the worst, rightly so, and he rushed back to warn his party. Soon he'd got many of them gathered at the lifeboats, including Eliza Niffenegger, a girl he had come to know in his travels. The pair were guided into a boat, and they waited for the crew to lower away. But as the crew frantically ducked in between the gathered crowd of passengers, a sense of unease gripped them. It was starting to look as if the crew didn't really know what to do. Boats were sitting loaded with people, but they weren't being lowered. From the bridge, it seemed to some as if Captain de l'Oncle had just lost control of the situation. He shouted and swore at nobody in particular. A pair of Dominican priests roamed the deck offering words of reassurance. One boat did get away, loaded with women and children. Antoine Achard, a Frenchman, had got his wife, his young son Antonin, and 16-year-old daughter Marie into it, and took great satisfaction in seeing it lowered safely into the water. He turned to find a boat for himself. At this most crucial of moments, when unease was taking hold and panic was on the verge of breaking out, the officers and the crew alone decided what happened next. A well-drilled, well-motivated crew would have got all the boats away and worked to the last under the watchful eye of the officers. Instead, some said they heard the fourth engineer roar, "Damn the passengers, let them save themselves. We save ourselves first," before muttering something about shooting anybody down that got in the way with his revolver. Then, it happened. Panic gripped the crew and it spread like wildfire to the passengers. It broke out in pockets around the ship. Passengers began jostling for a spot, but crewmen began pushing them back. It grew in violence. Amidst one panicked crowd, the big wrestler, Yusuf Ismail, was said to have been seen pushing people out of the way to try to reach a boat, and even brandishing a stiletto knife. Lifeboats became territory to be defended. One boat was seized by a group of passengers who threatened anybody away with knives. The boat wasn't being lowered, it just sat on the boat deck, but the illusion of safety was enough to drive the men to defend it like it was the Alamo. The crew broke entirely. There was supposed to be 25 to a boat for loading and lowering, but in one instance only 6 or 7 showed up to their proper station. They began beating passengers down with anything at hand: oars, boat hooks. Women and children were forced out of the boats and held back while one was lowered filled entirely with crewmen. No one can realise the panic which ensues when an accident like the one we unfortunately met with happens, one crewman later said. The passengers blocked the way of the men. It was impossible to get at the boats unless one beat his way through the solid mass of humanity. Some of the passengers grabbed hold of us and implored us on their knees to save them. From his boat, Fred Niffler watched in horror as Pandemonium broke out on deck, but worse still, nobody seemed to be coming to cut his boat free. Piecing apart exactly what happened that day is difficult. Newspapers ran with the most extraordinary stories, and sorting out the more baffling and extreme tales becomes difficult. There's no doubt that given the diverse makeup of the passengers and the crew, racism crept into reporting, and it coloured the events with a tinge of bigotry. But what is clear is that the behaviour of the crew was shocking. One man, a sea captain from the US named Walter Clark, approached a lifeboat with his wife but was supposedly told, "No women allowed," by the occupants. "I prefer to drown with my wife," he said, "than be saved alone," and the two were last seen standing arm in arm as the ship went down. The last few minutes on board the Bourgogne witnessed some of the most terrible scenes of horror and cruelty that have blotted the history of a civilized race, ran an article in the Kansas City Journal. Instead of the heroic discipline which so often has been the one bright feature of such awful moments, the crew of the steamer fought like demons for the few lifeboats and rafts, battering the helpless passengers away from their only means of salvation, with the result that the strong overcame the weak. The priests, who had earlier been offering reassurance, now gave absolution instead, and the end was coming. La Bourgogne had only minutes left to live, but Fred Niffler and Eliza Niffenegger sat frozen in their boat as white, foaming water roared up the deck toward them. The liner leant over heavily, throwing people off their feet, sliding across the deck into the water below. The ship's stern was rising high into the air, and some boats, lowered at the last moment, were stuck because nobody could knock the hooks loose. Posed with her stern in the sky, La Bourgogne hung there for a moment before, with a crack and a sigh, she plunged down and disappeared from the surface. Fred Niffler and his friend Eliza were sucked down into the ocean. They'd made it to that lifeboat, but it was never launched. Fred was the only survivor. Eliza and the others were never seen again. All around, people called for help from the waves, but it was the women who suffered worst of all. Weighed down by their layers of sodden clothes and weak with exhaustion, they simply disappeared beneath the surface. Some had been subjected to a horrific sight. As the ship went down, her funnels collapsed, and one clipped a boat and cleaved it in half. The French passenger, Antoine Archard, had seen to it that his wife and their children, Antonine and Marie, all got into that boat safely, but then they were struck by a funnel as it came down. The boat was smashed to kindling, the occupants were crushed or flung out, and in what was described as the most blood-curdling sight many survivors ever saw, Mrs. Archard was cut nearly in half by the funnel's guide wires. Marie and Antonine were lost, along with the rest. Fred Niffler fought for the surface and found a raft with a handful of people perched on top, but they were soon thrown off by the waves. When the raft righted itself, he clambered on, but he was appalled to see other boats and rafts full of men beating at people in the water with their oars and boat hooks if they tried to grab on. One woman held onto a line trailing in the water. Seeing her clinging to the lifeboat like a dead weight, a sailor unsheathed his knife and cut her loose. Niffler saw another passenger, an American man, beaten over the head until he let go and drifted away. 30 minutes later, as the screams of those in the water had largely died out, the fog slowly receded, revealing the Cromartyshire off in the distance. The bark's crew were met with a horrifying sight of their own. Hundreds of bodies bobbed in the water, rising and falling with each wave. Some still clung to scattered debris in a final, desperate grasp for survival. Captain Henderson balked at the scene and he ordered his ship's lifeboats to be lowered at once. La Bourgogne had been carrying 506 passengers and crew, but in the end, only 163 were pulled from the water, or from the lifeboats. Just one woman, Victoire Lacasse, has survived. She was one of around 200 women who had boarded the ship days earlier, but nearly half of La Bourgogne's crew survived. Only 1 in 10 of her passengers made it off. Not a single one of the 44 children on board were rescued. Later that afternoon, Cromartyshire was able to signal the passing Allen Line steamer Grecian. The survivors were transferred to the bigger steamer and each received medical aid from the ship's doctor. When both ships and their passengers arrived in Halifax on July 6th, throngs of reporters and officials gathered around the harbour to record witness testimony as quickly as possible. What they heard absolutely shocked them, and as telegraphs and newspaper officers chatted, it shocked the entire globe as well. The reporting was unrelenting, voyeuristic. One passenger reported seeing a woman's throat cut while she was on the lifeboat just so she could be tossed over and lighten the vessel's load. Men had held women and children aside as the boats were launched. Charles Duttweiler, a German passenger, claimed that he had initially taken refuge in a lifeboat that was still tethered to the ship, but when he realised it would soon be dragged down, he jumped into the water. After nearly half an hour in the freezing sea, having fought the violent suction of the sinking vessel, a lifeboat full of passengers passed him. When he tried to climb on board, the men inside drove him back with boat hooks and violently scraped at his eyes. They assaulted many passengers with any implement that came to hand, he said, and if no instrument was to be had, they punched the men and women helplessly into the water with their fists. Another witness, John Burgle, described how he and his mother had secured 2 places in a lifeboat before it became crowded with crew, and they turned on them. He says they threw his mother over the side before forcing him out at least 5 times and beating him over the head with an oar. He survived 9 hours in the water before being rescued by the Cromartyshire. Many of the male passengers who survived lost their entire families, mothers, wives, and children. The Canadian Wreck Commissioner urgently convened an inquiry on July 12th in Halifax to get to the bottom of exactly what had happened. According to Cromartyshire's skipper and the crew, they were travelling at a speed of only 4.5 knots at the time of the collision. They maintained they'd heard the bleating from a ship's whistle somewhere out in the fog and they had kept a sharp lookout. Captain Henderson ordered his men to continuously sound their own foghorn in response. That was standard practice. Then, at something around 5 a.m, a large steamer suddenly hove in sight, clearly moving at a great clip, and nothing like the 4.5 knots Cromartyshire was making. The collision was sudden and unavoidable, but Henderson and his men soon found that even though it was missing most of its bow, their ship's collision bulkhead was holding up, and she wasn't in immediate risk of sinking. With fog still swirling around though, it was impossible to go sending boats off into the murk to find the other vessel. Besides, they still had work to do securing their starboard anchor, which was now swinging wildly and threatened to punch in the bow plates. As the fog lifted about 5:30 a.m, the Cromartyshire's men spotted 2 small boats flying the French flag, and soon the scale of the disaster became apparent. To take them all on, the crew jettisoned more than 30 tons of cargo to lighten the load, and they did everything they could to rescue anybody from the water that was still, by some miracle, alive. In the end, the Commissioner exonerated Cromartyshire entirely and put the blame squarely on La Bourgogne for not sticking to the usual sea lanes and barrelling through at such high speeds in a dense fog. Unfortunately, Captain de l'Oncle could not give his own testimony because he and his senior officers had died with their ship. But clearly, the nature of the damage indicated that La Bourgogne had been going at great speed. What the Canadian inquiry didn't touch on was the conduct of La Bourgogne's officers and crew during the sinking. For their part, La Bourgogne's owners, the French line, fought against allegations of misconduct and cowardice. They disagreed with reports of their sailors threatening passengers with knives, suggesting those that had really been passengers themselves. A British inquiry found the French ship to blame. The French, predictably, blamed the British crew martyr. It was an ugly business, and a dazzling array of lawsuits hit the courts as furious passengers sought to retrieve damages from French line. Some of the rulings that came out of these are downright baffling. One woman was awarded damages by a French court for losing her husband before the decision was reversed, since the general attitude in France had been that de l'Oncle and La Bourgogne could not have been at fault for the incident, so the ship's owners were cleared. A US District Court judge ruled that because the ship had been carrying a sufficient number of lifeboats, that the French owners' liability should be limited, and that, as for La Bourgogne's speed, even though, quote, it must be found that the ship was in fault for failure to reduce her speed to a point of safety or to one at which such a collision might have been avoided, that it is held by the court that there is no evidence of negligence in this regard which can be attached to the owners of the vessel. There can be no recovery, ruled Judge Townsend. Under the general maritime law for damages for negligence resulting in death on the high seas, therefore the petitioner is not liable for claims for loss of life, and the petition of the company is granted. Judge John F. Dillon, who had actually lost his wife in the sinking, was asked if he'd take a part in proceedings. He replied, "I'm engaged in no litigation in this matter. I gave it up in disgust long ago. No matter if 100 courts or men should say that there was no culpability attaching to the company for the loss of that ship, I should know that there was." Judge Townsend granted damages to just 5 claimants and limited the amount to $35,000 in total, against the $3.5 million survivors had demanded. Outraged, survivors brought the case to the Supreme Court, but they too sided with French line, suggesting that the company had issued instructions for captains and crew to slow down in fog, and that de l'Oncle, of his own accord, had simply ignored those rules. The fault was his, not the company that employed him. Then, just as now, the system was geared to protect owners and shareholders at the expense of the everyday citizen, the actual victims who'd lost their loved ones and virtually everything they owned. Lawsuits carried on for years, and for the next decade, French line waved away the mounting accusations from survivors against their officers and crew, insisting they'd upheld their duties. And any alleged violence, they argued, was the work of, quote, desperate men travelling in steerage, actually blaming their own passengers, of whom hundreds had died. Not all of La Bourgogne's crew had abandoned their passengers, though. By many accounts, the second officer had worked hard to release and launch what lifeboats he could, but the conduct of the rest of the crew was beyond appalling. When they were ordered to produce La Bourgogne's logbooks going back 2 years, French line simply refused and weakly suggested they just hadn't been kept. The New York Times did not hold back. The whole de l'Oncle family, read one article, are a hysterical, half-witted set, and personally I should never have cared to trust my life or property to any one of them. Louis de l'Oncle, commander of the Bourgogne, used to boast of his skill in manoeuvring a ship which, to judge from the accounts of his own friends and his surviving brother, principally consisted in threatening to run down any vessel that came in his way. "I tried to get a boat down," recounted New Yorker Otto Zieser, "and one of the ship's waiters pushed me away and told me to go to hell." After Zieser had been rescued by the British ship, he said, "The captain of the Crow Martyr called for volunteers, but not one of the Frenchmen would volunteer to go out at first, and the crew of the sailing ship had to go out." One of the officers of the Grecian, another rescue ship, had looked at the miserable bunch of rescued La Bourgogne crew later with disgust. "If I had my way," he said, "they would have all been hanged to the yardarm long ago." Probably the most agonising, frustrating aspect of the whole La Bourgogne saga is that there's really no closure. There's no way to tie the story up in a satisfying way. Life simply continued on as normal. There were no changes within the French line, All that was left behind was a mass of widows and orphans, devastated families on both sides of the Atlantic. For days, weeks, and months afterward, bodies were found at sea, still in their life jackets. Passengers who had entrusted their lives to French line and had been abandoned at every possible step. "14 years later, and the officers and crew of a great steamship were confronted with sudden disaster. With only limited time left to fill their ship's boat with passengers, they had to work quickly and efficiently to get the boats away. Only this time, they would, under no circumstances, allow crew or male passengers to cause such a shame as La Bourgogne's had. With obsessive ruthlessness, Second Officer Charles Lightoller filled his lifeboats with only women. Male passengers, boys even, were pulled out before the boats were got away. Under his eye, this disaster would not become a byword for the sacrifice of women and children. But if not enough women or children could be found, then the boats were lowered away, half-filled. Lightoller must have worked that night with visions of La Bourgogne still in his mind. Inadvertently, though, his dedication to allowing only women aboard resulted in many male lives being lost that night, as well as those of women who refused to be separated from their men. That ship was, of course, the RMS Titanic, and the La Bourgogne had, in a roundabout way, claimed its last victims.